Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our Bible study going through the life of David. I know we skipped last week. I was very busy and out of town for a while, but we are back now to continue the series. I'm so excited. If you have a Bible, please turn to 2 Samuel chapter 12. We are picking up where we left off last time, actually, and if you remember what happened last time, we were talking about David's greatest mistake. We were talking about the drift of sin and how David made every drift step possible. He walked out on his own. He didn't do what he was supposed to do. He didn't follow God's plan for him, because at the time where he was supposed to go to war with his kingdom, he stayed home. He went off by himself to be alone. He didn't talk to anyone. He didn't associate with anyone. Then he sees Bathsheba, a beautiful woman bathing on the roof. He sees her. He gets all excited. He wants to know who she is. He gets warned, hey, she's off limits. She's already married. But he doesn't care. He calls for her. She comes to him, and then they sleep together, and then finds out she's pregnant, so he's got to find a way to cover it up. So he calls her husband home from the wars, but he's too good of a man to go home. So he eventually, since he can't get him to go home and make love to his wife to hide the affair, he decides to have him killed on the battlefield, and he doesn't care. And then he takes Bathsheba to be his wife, and they're going to have a son together. Yeah. It's pretty messed up. It is pretty messed up what David does. And we talked all about that last week. If you want, well, not last week, but the week before last. So if you want to hear the full story behind that, go back and check out last video. But today we're going to talk about what happens next. We're going to be talking about the blessing of rebuke. Rebuke is a word, for those of you who don't know, which basically means to call out or to confront. And that is something that we don't like to do. Not just as Christians, but as people. Quite often, we don't like to rebuke people, especially people that are friends, because there's always a fear that we may lose them. There's always a fear that they may get upset with us. But sometimes I believe that rebuke can be the most powerful and important thing that we can give and experience. And we're going to be talking about that today in 2 Samuel chapter 12. Hope you guys are excited. Let's not waste any time. Let's dive right into this. So, what I want to talk about is, if you take notes when you do these, and I hope you do, because, I mean, there's just so many notes you can take, make two columns. The first column is titled, What David Needed. So these are the things that David required. But then the second column put in, What Nathan provided. Now, for those who don't remember, Nathan is a prophet. He is basically David's spiritual advisor. Whenever David needs to talk to someone about God's will or about God's plan, Nathan is the guy he goes to. Now, Nathan is a friend of David. He's very friendly to David, and he's also a little bit of a yes man. He was the guy who, when David was saying, I'd like to build a temple to God, David was like, you do it, David. You do whatever you want to do, because God's with you. And God had to step in and say, now hold on, both of you, cut it out. You know, that kind of thing. But now God is speaking to Nathan. And God has said, Nathan, speak to David. So here's what happened. The first thing that David needed, he needed to recognize his sin. Write that down. David needed to recognize his sin. And we're going to see that here in chapter 12, verse 1 through 7. Let's read it together. The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. So to basically give you guys an idea of what just happened there, in Jewish customs, if you have a guest come to your house, it is proper manners and customary to take one of your best lambs or best goats or best livestock and use it to make a feast for this guest. So this rich man in Nathan's story doesn't want to use one of his own livestock to feed his guest, so he steals the ewe lamb. Ewe is a type of sheep. He steals the lamb from the poor man to make the feast instead, and this lamb was super important to the poor man. So David hears this, and we hear how he reacts in verse 5. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, You are that man. Ouch. Just ouch. And essentially, that's what David was. And you know, it's a funny thing. We have this bad habit of accusing other people. We are very good at noticing other people's sin. Man, I'm glad I'm not like that guy. Dude, I can't believe what this person did. We are very good at pointing at other people. So here we have that. Nathan says, hey, David, let me tell you a story about this guy in a faraway territory. Let me tell you what happened to this guy. Have you heard this story? He tells him the story. David, oh, that's awful. How dare he do that? He took that person's property. He took what belonged to that other man, and he killed him. He should die for that. In fact, he should have to pay for that lamb 4 times over for what he did. He took something that didn't belong to him and had no pity. And Nathan's like, sound familiar? You took Bathsheba, and then when you couldn't cover up what you'd done, you killed her husband, Uriah. You are that man. Dang. First thing that David needed, he needed to recognize his sin. But the second thing he needed, let's go on to the second thing, he needed to be reminded of God's presence. Quite often when we're wrapped up in the confines of our sin, when we're living in our sin, we need to be reminded that God is there. And Nathan does. Read on in verse 7. We'll start with verse 7 again and go into verse 8. Then Nathan said to David, you are that man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. God is essentially telling David, look at all the things I've given to you, David. I delivered you from Saul. I gave you his palace and his throne. I gave you his wives. I gave you the land. I gave you Judah. And if that wasn't enough, if that still wasn't enough, I still would have given you more because I love you, David. I've given you so much. I've given you everything. And yet you did this? Quite often when we are wrapped up in sin, we don't remember God being there. So the second thing David needed was to be reminded that God is there. We need to be reminded God is ever present. Because what sin does is it makes us forget God. When I sin, when I do wrong, quite often I'm not thinking about God. I'm not thinking about all the blessings and expectations and commandments God has given me. The only thing I'm thinking about is myself. So the second thing he needed to be told. God is always present, and he has gotten you to where you are. Did you forget that? The third thing David needed, he needed to realign with God's commands. He needed to realign with God's commands. Read verse 9 through 10 with me. Verse 9, why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword will never depart from your house because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. Read that first part again in verse 9. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil? We hear that word despise. I don't think y'all realize what despise means. The original word despise means to think little of or to make little of. Why did you think little of my commands? Why did you think little of my laws? Why did you do this? After all I've given you, after all you've accomplished, after all that we've done together, David, why did you do this? And as a result, he says what the result will be. He says, because you struck down Uriah with the sword and took his wife to be your own, the sword will never depart from your house. And it's true. As we read further into David's life, we see that's exactly what happened. David's entire family is destroyed by conflict and war. It's pretty ugly. And we'll get into that later. But those are the things David needed. First, he needed to recognize his sin. He needed to be reminded of God's presence, and he needed to realign with God's commandments. Now, that's all pretty heavy stuff. And now I want to talk about what Nathan did. Because here's the thing. Those are all things that the rebuked needs. The one who did wrong, that's what they need. But what do you have to give? What does Nathan have to give? Because let me be clear. Some of you right now are David. You've done something wrong, terribly wrong, and you need to be rebuked by a friend, by a family member, by a stranger. You need to be brought low. I'll be real. You need to recognize that sin. You need to realign with God's commands. You need to feel God's presence. But some of you need to be Nathans. Some of you need to approach someone who you know has sinned and speak to them. How do you do it? Let's go into that second column. Let's talk about what Nathan provided. First, Nathan provided the right timing. The passage doesn't say this, but it's been a year since David killed Uriah. It has been a whole year. And you might think, now why on earth would that be the case? Why on earth would God let David live with this for a whole year? When we talk about the consequences of God, we often are afraid of the closed fist of God. We don't want God to bring his wrath down on us with a fist. But you want to know what's worse than the fist of God? The open hand of God. When he doesn't do anything. Because sometimes what God does is he says, you have chosen to walk away from me. Therefore, I'm going to let you live with the consequences of that. I'm not going to do a dang thing. You live with that. You live with the results of your sin. And I'm convinced, ladies and gentlemen, that is the case with America right now. I believe that God has looked at America and said, if this is how you want to live, I'm going to let you live in that for a while. I believe that's where we are as a nation. You have chosen to walk away from me. You've chosen to live your own way. Fine. Enjoy the results. I'm not going to step in. So David for a year has had to live with the consequences of his sin, the consequence of his guilt. Because David knows what he did. So it's all about the right timing. When we want to rebuke someone, quite often it is tempting to just run in and say, you son of a, do you know what you did? Like, I can't believe you, and just go off on them right away. But sometimes you need to let things stir. Not only for them, but for you too. Because if you go to them right away about what they did, quite often it gets lost in your own personal anger. And it's not about your personal anger. It is about setting things right. The second thing he provided was the right tenacity. Remember, Nathan was David's friend. They were buddies. And I'm sure it was hard for Nathan to be the one to go to David and say, do you realize what you did? Nathan wants to help David. He doesn't want to rebuke him. And that's the way we often feel, isn't it? Sure, it's easy to rebuke someone at work who you have a beef with. That's easy. What about when it's your mom? Or your brother? Or your sister? Or your dad? Or your best friend? What about when it's someone that you're close to? It's not so easy anymore. You need to have the right tenacity. You need to go in and be prepared and say, look, I love you, man, or girl, whichever. I love you. I care about you. And because I care, we need to have a talk. The third thing, he provided the right tone. Notice how Nathan approached him. Nathan didn't go to him and say, okay, look, David, you're a piece of crap. You're a terrible human being. I can't believe you would do something like this. And by God, I wish that he'd strike you down right here. Do you realize what a piece of junk you actually are? No, he didn't. He knew that wouldn't get through to David. So he starts with, David, let me tell you a story, man. Sit down. I'm going to tell you something interesting. I heard this story. You may find it interesting. Then lays out the story. And then when David reacts, how could that happen? He'd go, yeah, David, that's you, man. That's you. He did not do it with anger. Think about this for a second. Our tone should be one of restoration, because God's tone is restoration. We like to think of God as a judgmental God, a judging, harsh God. And don't get me wrong, he is a judge. But his tone has always been one of restoration. He wants to save you. He wants to save you. People nowadays get this idea of God that he's some kind of evil, harsh, cruel God who just looks forward to killing people who don't please him. It's not the case. He doesn't look forward to it. In fact, it hurts him to condemn any of his children. He wants to save lives. He wants to help people. His tone has always been one of restoration. Therefore, ours should be one of restoration. The fourth thing he provided the right truth. Look at verse 9 again. Let's look at verse 9 again. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. Now go to verse 11. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household, I'm going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. You know here's the thing about the truth. I'm going to tell you guys something crazy. Have you guys ever heard this line from Ben Shapiro where he says, facts don't care about your feelings? It's a nice quote. Let me give you a different one. The truth doesn't have to be kind. It just has to be true. The truth doesn't have to be sweet. It just has to be true. Wrong is wrong. That's the truth. I don't care if it hurts. Truth is truth. You did something evil. You have engaged in something wicked, and now there are consequences. Nathan could have gone up to him and said, okay, look, David, you did a bad thing. Okay, yeah, it's not a big deal though, it's not a bad thing. We can move past this, it's not something we gotta worry about. You're the king, right? God loves you. You're gonna be okay. You're gonna be fine. No, he laid it out very clearly. You did an evil, wicked thing. You despised the rule of the Lord, and now here's what's going to happen. Everything you did is going to come back to bite you in a big way. That's the truth. It doesn't have to be pretty. It just has to be true, and that's what it was. He provided the right truth. What you did was wrong, and now there are consequences. So when you rebuke, when you come to your neighbor and you tell them what they're doing wrong, I'm not saying that you can't be compassionate. Like I said earlier, come with the right tone, but also don't lie. Don't lie to save face. Wrong is wrong. Tell the truth. That's exactly how I would approach it and how I would tell you to approach it. And last but not least, the final thing that he provided the right grace. Guys, this goes back to Jesus. When Peter asked Jesus, how many times must we forgive those who do us wrong? He said, not just 7 times, but 70 times 7. Now, before you pull out a calculator to start calculating that, let me explain. It's not literal. It's a metaphor. God created the world in 7 days. He created the world in 7 days. 7 is kind of a biblical number. Every day, in every way, we should forgive. Because God always forgives us. When we rebuke, we should provide the right grace. We should forgive. Quick to forgive. Slow to anger. Look at verse 13. When David had been told all this, like David has just been told all this by Nathan, then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Notice that. He recognizes it. He realizes, oh my gosh, you're right. I've sinned. I've done wrong. I can't, you're right. I've sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this, you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, hold up, Raven, whoa. What? I thought you just said he showed grace. He did. He didn't kill David. Remember what David said at the beginning. He said, the man who took that ewe lamb deserves to die and pay back that lamb 4 times over. He's right. That's the law. That is the rule. That's the very rule the king just decreed. Let's pretend for a moment that story is true about the rich man and the poor man. David just said, bring that rich man to me. He deserves to die for what he did. And now Nathan has said, David, you're the rich man. by your own law, you deserve to die. But Nathan has just said, you won't. God is because you realize you've sinned and you've asked for forgiveness, you will not die. But there is still a price. The son that you had that was born from this sin will die. And that's something that I really want to leave you guys with as we wrap this up. God removes sin, but that also means that he has to remove the product of sin. This is very symbolic. David did a wicked thing with Bathsheba. Now they have a kid out of it. That kid that they had is the result of David's infidelity and his killing of Uriah. God is going to remove that sin, and that also means removing the result. And you might say, that's so mean to the baby. In our modern day context, in our way of looking at the world from a very moral, unique lens, yes, but to God, the baby was always his. He's just calling it home. And some of you may say that's not enough, and we can have a much longer discussion on this topic of morality when it comes to what God does and what God doesn't do. But the point that I want to make is this. Rebuke is an incredibly important thing that is required for us to receive and for us to offer. It is a blessing. Had David not been brought forward with this by Nathan, he probably would never have really committed to change. The things David needed was to recognize that he was a sinner, reminded that God is there, and realign with God's commandments. And Nathan, who is the one who did the rebuking, he came at the right timing, with the right tenacity, with the right tone, giving the right truth with the right grace. Rebuke is hard to give and to receive, but it is a blessing at the same time. Through this, David learned a valuable lesson about all that he did wrong, and next time we meet, we're going to talk about the next step of this rebuke, the next step of David being purified and cleansed, how he sets himself on the right path. We're going to talk about that all next time, but that'll wrap it up for us. Thank you guys so much for watching. I know this was a long one and a long time coming, but I hope you guys enjoyed, and as always, I will see you in my next video. Take care.